As someone who quite often especially my younger life, found myself in spaces where questions were not welcomed, I too am grateful for the spaces where they are not only welcomed, but strongly encouraged. The show Jesus Christ Superstar is pretty consistent with one thing: controversy. It stirred a lot of trouble in its time. In the late 60s and the early 70s, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice unleashed their rock opera. First as an album, as a double album, and then it was later set for stage and found its way on Broadway. Now, the show struggled to find its way on stage in those early years, but did in fact go on to become a huge success. Somehow it was able to really connect with a lot of people. It was a wild and fresh new way of looking at an ancient story through a modern day lens. It took liberties with the source materials, admittedly, and it used plenty of imagination, especially in the language and the depiction of its colorful cast and members. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, both whom identify as agnostic, or at least not fully claiming the divinity of Jesus, they were in their early 20s. One was 21 and the other was 25 at the time they wrote these words and put it to music. I find that impressive. I find their level of engagement and creativity quite inspiring. I'm left in awe by what they were able to do. And so, I think they've gained some notoriety. Now it's Lord Andrew Lloyd Webber and Sir Tim Rice. So I think they've moved up in the world just a little bit. They had gained some popularity after their show Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and wanted to keep those Bible-based bass lines going. It started out as an album because no producer wanted to go there with Jesus Christ Superstar. They didn't want to risk making it a stage show. Once, the creators were told that it was the worst idea in history. Because some people just can't roll with the funk. Those Superstar rattled Bible thumpers, it did conquer the billboards. Now, which group do you think was triggered the most when the musical first made its debut? It was evangelical Christians that rose up in opposition to everything the show was about. For many Christians here in the state, the vision and depiction was blasphemous, and the religious views held by its creators were offensive and heretical. Its depiction of Jewish leaders also fueled some anti-Semitism, and the American Jewish Committee protested the production. And when you see the musical, it's easy to see. One guy that I know didn't care for it at all was the late Billy Graham. He didn't like that it ended right before the resurrection. He said that it bordered on blasphemy and sacrilege. You can actually find his sermon titled Jesus Christ Superstar online, but don't go out of your way to watch it. At one point, he is really hammering away at Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice that they asked the question of, who do you say that you are? And Jesus Christ is more than any of these two men from Britain could ever claim him to be. He's quite heated in this sermon. He's a little nervous about the story it's telling. I'm actually going to use the scripture that Billy Graham used in 1971 in his sermon titled Jesus Christ Superstar, but I'm going to look at it from a slightly different angle. We're going to put that on the screen now. From Matthew 16. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah. And still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Now, the sermon today isn't going to be an apologetics on Jesus Christ Superstar. That's not what I intend to do. But I do think we really need to consider what we can learn from this amazing show. I want to share about why it's one of my favorite musicals. In 2007, as a non-religious person, and really a non-believing person, I had a friend, also non-religious and agnostic, introduce me to this album. The only heresy he found was if I didn't listen to it on vinyl first, because that's the only true way to hear Jesus Christ Superstar, especially for the first time. It was my first real encounter with the Jesus story. At first, I felt like I was listening to something I shouldn't be listening to. It was telling the story from the point of view of Jesus, and I had always heard that he was kind of pure evil, right? Jesus was hitting high notes, and I heard lots of electric guitar. I thought Bible stuff could only be played on organ and piano. There were wild lines that would come out of nowhere that you're not quite used to hearing Jesus say, like, "Mary, ooh, that is good. Why do you prattle through your supper?" That was not what I remembered hearing Jesus say in some of the Gospels when I was growing up. Jesus hitting high notes really hit a note with me. The most shocking aspect of what I was hearing in Jesus Christ Superstar were the questions that it was asking. I didn't know much, admittedly, but I knew enough to know that asking questions wasn't really a great idea when it came to things like the Scriptures or Jesus himself. We were told with certainty that this is what we are to believe. And why would we have any questions if we have a strong enough faith? That never really clicked for me. I could never really relate to that kind of teaching. Weber and Rice's lyrics especially, ask a lot of questions that can make people squirm. Judas singing in the opening lines, "You really do believe that this talk of God is true?" Mary Magdalene singing, "Should I bring him down? Should I scream and shout? Should I speak of love, let my feelings out?" But I think that her most haunting question, what's it all about? King Herod wants to know, as a ruler and person in power, aren't you scared of me, Christ? Aren't you scared of me, wonderful Jesus Christ? And finally, the deeper question in the show's finale, sung by Judas, the great bad guy of the Gospels. Do you think you're what they say you are? Asking that of Jesus as he carries his cross in the show. Questions that would make some toes curl. And I got to tell you, friends, I was obsessed with it. I loved it. Every note, every track. I was finally hearing something authentic and real. And that seemed a little weird and a little strange for me. I played it on constant repeat on my iPod because iPods were a thing back then. I then later went on to watch the 1973 movie, and it had more exposed stomachs and hip thrusts than I was expecting at the time. The images of Judas being chased by tanks and helicopters and weapons of war not only spoke volumes to a world entangled in Vietnam at the time, but it was pretty relevant and quite profound for this post-9/11 high school and college grad. It had something to say. And it was saying it pretty well to me. Especially lyrics coming from Judas when he says, "All your followers are blind. There's way too much heaven on their minds." It's a finger poke in the eye of Christians that are content with watching the world war with itself. Or maybe his critique is about how fame has made the idea of Jesus bigger than the things Jesus taught. Important things to ponder. I've watched different versions of the stage production in the years that followed. The 2013 show with Tim Minchin as Judas is absolutely incredible. Andrew Lloyd Webber made that show available for free on his YouTube channel during Holy Week, and Heather and I watched it again this year because he did it last year as well. It features news stories at the very beginning during its opening scenes and credits. News stories of angry mobs knocking down fences, hurling punches at each other. It was eerily relevant, as Heather noted when we were watching it this year. Relevant especially of the events that followed the attack in January just this year. In 2018, NBC put on a live production that aired nationally. John Legend plays Jesus. And how cool is it that Alice Cooper was Herod, a role that he was actually filling again. And this exposed an entirely new generation to the show's most diverse and inclusive cast it has ever had. I've learned that the story of Jesus is one that speaks to every single generation, and often it does that in new ways. We're okay with that, right? At some point, maybe we should have a space to explore questions of faith rather than being force-fed answers. It's what I needed for myself. That's what I want for my children and for the people that come asking important questions. For me in my own story, I was finding that space to ask questions more in a Broadway musical than I ever had in any church. What's that all about? I found that early on I was given a domesticated version of the gospel. It was neat and tidy, and it had a perfect little bow that sat on top. If I just heard it and received it and took it in, it would all make perfect sense, and life would be great. Life would be easy. Life would be smooth sailing, and when I died, I'd go to heaven. But the cut and paste, the black and white faith that I remember so early on, it didn't connect. If I had questions, then I was told, well, then I just need to read the source material again. As I reflected on all of this, I was struck by how some of the best theological discussions I genuinely think I have ever had have been with my atheist and agnostic friends. And I have a few of them. Why is that? Why is that? I think the part of it, especially in the friends that I know and have had conversations with, they are comfortable with going there. They really don't mind asking the hard stuff and getting into the dirt and the mud of human experiences. They want to try to understand what's going on with this God, with this gospel, this Jesus. Maybe it's those of us who are religious, who find ourselves day in and day out in the church. What if we're the ones that have grown far too uncomfortable with questions? And that seems a little backwards to me. It seems a little out of order. I think the Bible wants us to engage it with questions. And this is how Scripture was studied in antiquity. The Psalms model great questions of faith, honesty with God, a real wrestling with theology. The larger story of God and Christ is one that looks at faith, calling, and purpose. And it wants us to ask the question like Mary does in Jesus Christ Superstar, what is it all about? How do I learn to love this God? How do I love this God? When Jesus is asking Peter the question, "Who do you say that I am?" I feel that. I feel it deeply. I did years ago when I heard that question for the first time. Who do you say that I am? And it's so incredibly invitational and not black and white at all. It's invitational and it's open for discernment and a deeper understanding of what the question even means. It is one that we have asked ourselves, at least I hope, at some point in our journey. Who do you say that I am? Broadway has shown itself to be a place open to asking the hard questions about life, exploring deep human themes of good things and honestly facing the difficult things. We should be that church. We can be that place for people to come and engage their questions with a faith that is being explored. I believe that we are called to be that space and so much more. Jesus Christ Superstar is a musical that asks hard questions about Jesus, about God and human society and power. It speaks to a longing to be saved and to see the world made right. It speaks to the difficulty of committing to things we deeply care about and the longing to see it through, even when it seems impossible. It expresses doubt in the things we think we know and shows us the dangers of resting comfortably in certainty. It was and is willing to go there and wade through the thick story that the Gospels are telling. So in a way, it's a lot like the Bible. Listening to Judas ask the question of who Jesus really is was a big moment in my life. It's a great question, and one that was eventually, though not immediately, answered in a meaningful and expansive way for me. I pray that those asking the same questions will be open to some of the answers that will eventually come.